Good evening, everyone. Welcome to ANU for this post-COP event. And I'd just like to say, Yuma, Darawal Muna, Darawal Ngunnawal. This is Ngunnawal country. Welcome to Ngunnawal country. And of course, I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also to recognise their ongoing contribution to the life and livelihoods and culture of Australia. So today we've got a really interesting panel speaking from a whole range of perspectives. Most of the people here on the panel have actually been to COP. They've actually seen the detail of the discussions at COP, something which those of us who stayed behind in Australia actually aren't privileged to see. And so there's the dynamics of the discussion are able to be sort of disclosed to some extent by our panelists here. As a person who viewed COP from outside, I guess that I saw it as a mixed bag. Clearly, the advances in terms of the loss and damage text and the establishment of that fund is a big step forward, and particularly welcome, I think, to our Pacific neighbours and also developing countries across the globe. But at the same time, recognising that there's very little detail behind the statement and intent there. Similarly, we had some advances in terms of the adaptation agenda, but again, there was some, from my perspective, limited take-homes from that, apart from sort of setting some of the framing for the global goal and adaptation. And in contrast, I think it's well known and commented on that there's also some backsliding there, and so some of the language around fossil fuels, phasing out to be watered down to phasing down. And the inclusion of unabated in relation to subsidies, the inclusion of ineffective subsidies or inefficient subsidies, and also the inclusion of low emissions in relation to the acceleration of the energy transition to add to renewables, all open doors for delay and ambiguity. And so that at this point in time, I think, is something we can't afford. Every year that goes past is chewing into our carbon budget really severely. That's that budget that's consistent with 1.5 or 2 degrees. And so that sort of delay and the lack of additional ambition coming out of COP in terms of emission reduction, for me, were really significant. And so that's why my own assessment from here was that it was very much a mixed bag. Now, we'll actually hear from our speakers today as to whether that in fact is their perspective, having been in those dynamics and seen how much of the intended implementation parts of this COP actually move forward and the nature and tone of those discussions that support that. So I think, Mahalani, you're going to introduce the panel?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just introduce the MC for this evening. It's Mahalani Delaney. So Mahalani works with us at ICEDS, the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and Mahalani's just finished a Master's on Environment and Management and Development. And so very soon we'll be graduating.
Couple of weeks.
A wonderful thing. So I'll just pass over to you, Mahalani.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you for the great summary of the outcomes of COP, and hoping that we can definitely dive into it more with the panelists here. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement and just express solidarity for solidarity in the fight for climate justice, especially for First Nations people in Australia, and particularly for Torres Strait Islanders whose rights are found to be violated from the UN Human Rights Committee by the Australian government for failure to meaningfully act on climate change. And also acknowledge that to truly tackle the climate and biodiversity crises that we're in, we need to be looking to and learning from First Nations people in Australia and all around the world. So thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Yes, I am Mahalani. I work at ICEDS and also study here at ANU, and was very lucky to be part of a group of Pacific Islanders and First Nations students who got to attend COP. And we were there for the whole 2 weeks of COP, as well as the pre-week, so from the 31st of October. So a long and great experience for us. And we're very lucky to have an awesome panel here today, including Stephen, who's joining us online behind us. Hi, Stephen. So I'll just start by introducing everyone here. So we've got Brianna Gordon, and Brianna is a proud Wiradjuri Gundungurra woman, currently studying a PhD with the ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society in collaboration with the School of Culture, History and Language, as well as La Trobe University. And Brianna's PhD looks at the extent of sources of mercury pollution in Gippsland in Victoria. And she has a background in medicinal chemistry and pharmacology, yes, but made the switch to environmental chemistry when she started working for the former DOR, which is now the Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. And when she is not studying or working, she enjoys spending time with her many pets. And we're also very lucky to have Sala Dr. George Carter here with us. And George is a research fellow in geopolitics and regionalism at the Department of Pacific Affairs at the ANU. And in 2019 also became the director of the ANU Pacific Institute. So it's quite an extensive one here. Oh, no. I'll also say George has been a negotiator for the Pacific for many years, participating in COPs, and this was a different bio to the one that I had, but essentially is amazing in the climate space and has done extensive work in ANU and around the region. And joining us online, we have Professor Stephen Bygrave, who has worked on climate change and renewable energy for 30 years across international organisations, government, academia and not-for-profit sectors. And he led teams that designed Australia's carbon price, the National Renewable Energy Target, New South Wales Net Zero Plan, the New South Wales Electricity Roadmap, ACT's 100% renewable energy target and ACT's net zero strategy. And he has held senior executive roles in government, including Executive Director for Climate Change and Sustainability in the ACT, Assistant Secretary in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Department of Climate Change, Department of Agriculture and Department of Environment and Heritage, and Strategic Advisor in the New South Wales Government. Extensive experience there as well. And finally, we have Professor Howard Bamsey, who is an honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance here at ANU. And he is a member of the boards of the Climate Policy Initiative and Climate Work Centre, and was previously chair of the Global Water Partnership and executive director at the Green Climate Fund and director general of the Global Green Growth Institute. So Howard has served as special advisor on sustainable development to Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and special advisor on green growth to AusAid. And earlier in his career, he was Australia's special envoy on climate change, a deputy secretary in the Australian Public Service and CEO of the Australian Greenhouse Office. So we've got a bunch of experience on this panel today, which is great. And as Mark mentioned, a number of us who were here, who were there in COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. So I'll just start off by inviting the panelists to give some introductory remarks, key takeaways from COP, and perhaps anything you think would be valuable for the audience here to know from your experience. And I will note as well that there will be time at the end of the event for Q&A. So feel free to just take notes as it's going along for anything that piques your interest, because there'll be an opportunity for that. So I'll start with Stephen, who's online. And if you could please keep it to 2 to 3 minutes, so I won't have to awkwardly cut you off, that would be wonderful. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Mahaleni. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's great.
Great. Hopefully the Wi-Fi holds up. Look, thanks very much for the opportunity to be on the panel. I think Mark's summary is pretty spot on, a mixed bag of outcomes. I think the things I would add was that Australia had a very strong presence in the negotiations, and I think Minister Bowen said a number of times, Australia is back. He said that loud and clear, and was also invited to lead the final discussions on climate finance as part of the cover statement. So it was quite a big responsibility for him and for Australia. And if anything, Australia is playing a role to stop or minimise the backsliding, which was kind of underway behind the scenes. So, and Australia was also playing a very strong role in terms of putting its proposal forward to host COP31 in 2026, and that proposal looks pretty strong. I think Turkey's also put forward a proposal, but Minister Bowen seemed pretty confident that Australia, along with the Pacific Islands, importantly, will hopefully be hosting that COP. So that's a great opportunity for Australia to really make a strong presence and to highlight the work that Australia has been doing on renewable energy, net zero transition, and adaptation and climate finance, the three key pillars of climate change action. So enormous opportunity, and I'm sure others will make this similar remarks about if we are to host COP in 2026, we need to start planning pretty soon if it's going to be a successful COP. I think one of the other remarks I would make was that the Egyptian presidency put a lot on the table for this last COP, probably too much, in fact. And it wasn't even until the last 24 hours where we had text that somehow was different to just dot points on over 20 pages. So it was down to the last minute in terms of the number of issues still on the table, and the whole process of finalizing that text went down to the wire. That's not uncommon, but I think the presidency, in terms of planning, it's a lesson, I think, for the whole planning process. If you think about Paris being a relatively successful COP, it was 2 to 3 years of diplomacy and planning, Cristina Figueres flying around the world, doing deals well before the COP was actually held. So a lesson for Egypt, a lesson for Australia if we are to host the COP in a few years' time. I think 1.5 degrees, there was some discussion through the meeting as to whether that text would be lost or removed from the final text. So thank goodness it was still in the final text. However, many NGOs and others in the Green Movement are saying, we're already 1.2. How can 1.5 actually still be a realistic goal? And a lot of discussion around renewable energy. So despite, Mark's comments around some erosion about, coal, phasing out of coal or phasing down of coal and removing subsidies, there was some quite strong text about the need for trillions of dollars of investment into renewable energy out to 2030. I might leave it there as an opening commentary. Thanks, Mahaleni.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I think it would be really great next to turn to George, and also maybe if you wanted to comment on what Stephen was speaking to about COP31 and expectations for the Pacific if they are going to co-host that with Australia.
Thank you very much, Mahaleni, for this invitation to participate. We've had a long 3 weeks, just managed to get off the plane about a couple of hours ago, so bear with me, one of my eyes full. But both speakers, Stephen and Mark, summed up, it's been a mixed bag, a lot of disappointments, but there are also some wins. The devil is in the detail for loss and damage. While we have establishment fund, it most likely will take another 8 to 10 years, relatively see a fund to come to place. The position that was put forth was, please just make an announcement. Although we know that you need the research, you need the institution, you need the funding, that will come later. But the best thing to get out of a COP is some form of announcement. And that is what we got. We got out of there with so many partners, including Australia, just have an announcement. But the devil's in the detail. We may not see this fund for another 8 to 10 years, even more. All right. So that's, while it's a plus, it's still a disappointment. All around, it's been a disappointment, even on the language of 1.5, as Stephen has said. There were even parties during the negotiations pushing for 2 degrees. Why use that language when it's no longer? But that's where ambition starts from. It needs to be withheld. And you have partners like Australia, like the European Union, who are trying to push on this. The geopolitics within climate negotiations is no longer just about the North and South. You have to look at the BRICS, the developing countries, the like-minded, those who are pushing human rights, those from the islands who are pushing vulnerability, those from Africa who are pushing their form of vulnerability. It's a mixed bag. Even Russia, as well, in terms of the crisis with Ukraine, trying to water down as much of the language so that it does not impinge on, what's happening in the crisis. So overall, while there are some steps, they're not as what we had wanted when we went in. Even in terms of finance, there's no consensus on the global goal or on adaptation, no global goal of adaptation. That's pushed to next year to try and talk about. Even on gender, that's the specific issue I went in to support Pacific countries to follow. We had one text that's all about the funding. Who is going to pay, support the further implementation of the gender action plan. It took us 6 days just to negotiate a paragraph on who should be participating, developed countries or developing countries within the position to do so. It took us 6 days for that one paragraph. It goes to show how it's getting harder and harder inside the climate negotiations. But you're seeing ambition come through different spaces. And so going back to the original question of Australia and the Pacific hosting, there is, it's not just Turkey. We also heard another European country putting up their bid, but I think they're going to pull their bid for this big bid from Australia and the Pacific Islands. Of course, there's a lot of excitement all around, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's not something that you just start today and in 3 weeks it completes. As Stephen has talked about, one of the frustration that parties had was the transparency process in which the Egyptian president did not inform of how this process is going to take. They did not come and soak the attention or listen to parties like in the Pacific when under the UK presidency, they came out. They had 2 ambassadors coming out constantly trying to get people on the table, or through the French presidency, which was a shadow diplomacy 2 years leading up to it. For the Egyptian presidency, we had to wait until we get there. And there was a lot of frustration that even to the last day, there were 14 agenda items open, still nowhere near, and it was still the first and second drafts. And we're like, well, is this going to push on, and we're already extended by another 24 hours. So there was a lot of frustration. But in a way, having another extra day in Sharm el-Sheikh, you tend to think this is the Egyptian style of diplomacy. They frustrate you. Like you can't do anything about it. And I think that's how they pulled it towards the end. That frustration just got us to the end. I mean, we left at 1 a.m. that night, only to get another message, closing ceremony at 3 a.m. We rushed back, And by that time, people were just sleeping on the tables, they were tired. And I think that's how we did not have any party with a big, it was that type of, you just get frustrated all the way to the end. And of course, there was a lot of diplomacy by ministers who were there to try to, this is the best we're going to take this year, we give again next year. But, Africa was saying, why take it when there's no teeth in this? But of course, what happened there was Egypt was saying, this is your COP, Africa. You need to say something to the world. And so they were also, in a way, held hostage to, we need to give something, although we don't like this, but we also have to say, Africa needs to say something about this. And in a way, so that's, I'm giving you another piece of confusion or frustration or dynamics, but this is what had happened. The devil, as I said, is in the detail to go through it. And while it may not give us, a level of ambition for the next 3 to 5 years, it's an ambition. I mean, it gives us something to keep going for the next year. But next year, come to Dubai, when it's about the global stocktake, I think all eyes will be on finance and adaptation. It's something we need to pay attention to.
Thanks so much, George. I think many people at COP share that feeling of frustration, but also the mixed bag of there's a lot of really positive things to come out of it, but So especially with the loss and damage, realizing that there actually is, even though there was an announcement, there is so much way to go still before that finance actually flows to the countries and people who need it. So I'll now turn to Howard. So you were able to observe COP from Australia, and I know you've been to a number of COPs previously, so it'd be great to get your insights from observing this one.
Thanks, Mahalani. Yeah, I wasn't there this time, but I've been to 22 or 23 other COPs, and that's relevant because this one followed the same rhythm as COPs usually do. A bit of fuss at the beginning, a lot of drama, much. I think of it as opera. A lot of blood on the floor. The villains look like they're going to triumph, and then at the end, after lots of death and destruction, everybody sort of joins hands and says, well, you know, it wasn't that bad after all. And certainly the Egyptians are happy with the outcome. Some of my friends who were very close to the core of the Egyptian organisers are sort of happy that they got a positive set of outcomes of some sort, of which the decision on loss and damage fund is, of course, the most important. I think, George, you've made the key point. You know, we need to know first who's going to put some money in it, because there isn't any, and second, who will be expected to put some money in. So that one of the key sort of issues around whether this decision will be made or not was related to essentially, will China pay? From the developed country side, with developed countries, as everyone knows, have resisted a fund for 10 years or more. From their perspective, this is an opportunity to maybe change the whole paradigm of funding within the climate system, and to recognise the realities. When the decisions were made about who would fund, they were really based on 1973 definitions of who was a developing country and who was developed. So there may be that was one of the subterranean sort of moves in this COP, I think, and let's see where it goes. Maybe nowhere, but it might. I think it's worth just a word on the context for the COP. You know, this was, as people have said, came in the midst of perma-crisis, you know, multi-crises. Everyone knows what they are, but they serve to distract attention from climate ambition. And I think we saw the results in the COP. 112 heads of government did turn up, but they didn't really do much. They didn't have the same impact in Sharm as they did in Glasgow, for example, and certainly not if you look at Paris. So loss and damage, who will pay, where it comes from, who will administer is an important issue, because the hazard, frankly, is that the money will come, if there is any money, it will come from adaptation funding, which is already grossly inadequate. So we've got to watch that. Depending on how it's administered, it could help. One of the key issues in funding adaptation is what is adaptation and how is it different from development? So if there is a fund that covers loss and damage, which you can see as development, it might be easier to resolve the issue within the funding mechanism of what is adaptation and to bring those two together in a satisfactory way. We'll see. Another development, just to mention, I think, was the deal on accelerating the move away from coal for Indonesia. That's a $20 billion deal, seems to have been brokered by John Morton in the White House, and involves Canada and Japan, but not Indonesia's southern neighbour, which is, in my mind, a question mark. Second point to mention that I think no one's mentioned yet is that a feature of the discussion and the negotiation this time was, you talked about frustration, George, with the organisers, but there's a lot of frustration with the multilateral development banks, that I think probably peaked because of recent comments by the president of the World Bank, but it's much broader. It's much broader than that and much deeper than that. That the banks are not really doing the task that is required of them to reflect the priority that climate change response should have. And I think we'll hear more of that, and we will see a response from the banks. Question mark in my mind is, where are we on Article 6, the markets question? Kate Hancock from Australia was one of the co-facilitators of that discussion. I've looked through the decisions, but I'm really not sure where that all came out and what the vibe is within the negotiating group. So at some point, I hope Kate will be able to tell us that. There's further guidance, but still some guidance to come on how that whole mechanism will work. And finally, I think if you twisted my arm and said, well, what do you think was the most significant development beyond the loss and damage decision in the COP, I would say the US and China talking again. Every time there's been a major change in that major progress in recent times on climate in the negotiating process, it's been on the back of US-China collaboration. This time we saw an incremental change because there had been no collaboration before the COP. But we saw John Kerry and Sears and Wah get together informally, and they've now been authorised to move to get together formally. That's a big deal, I think, for prospects for Dubai.
Thanks so much. Sounds like there's still a few question marks from some key issues. So if people want to ask some questions about that in the Q&A, I'm sure that would be welcome as well. And finally, Brianna, I guess sort of opposite experience to Howard here. This is our first COP, and it would be great to hear your experience.
Yeah, Yuri Marang, everyone. As Marani said, this is my first COP, and I went into it as an Indigenous person and being representative for Wiradjuri Gundungurra people and Indigenous Australians as a whole, but also as a scientist. I really was a layman's going into anything about the UNFCCC process or international conference and all of these international politics and how everything works with articles and all of that. So that's not really what I want to talk about, but I want to talk about the LSIP, which is held the week before COP, and that's the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. So that is a mandated mandated body under the UNFCCC that was founded at COP15 in Paris. COP21 in 2015 in Paris. And it's also the implementation of the LSIP is governed by the Facilitative Working Group, which is a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from the UNFCCC to try and essentially just put the operational aspects of the LSIP into play. And I was unfortunately really disappointed by the LSIP this year, but not surprised ultimately. I do not think that the Egyptian presidency gave the LSIP the resources or the care that it needs to be able to function properly and to be a space for useful dialogue for Indigenous people. And I don't think that Indigenous people were represented sufficiently by the Australian government either. A few things, we were in an outside meeting room. We did not get given an inside meeting room with functioning air conditioning or proper microphones. It was hot, it was loud, at times you couldn't hear people at all. The microphones didn't work, the translation didn't work. And there weren't even enough chairs, so we'd have elders from Indigenous groups around the world sitting on the floor because they didn't have enough chairs provided for the entire group, for everyone who showed up. And there wasn't that many people who showed up ultimately. And I did have a lot of concerns as well, given that we were in Egypt, which has a lot of human rights abuses. I felt that, and this was also reflected from people's comments from past COPs, that the types of conversations that were being had were not the radical Indigenous-led types of conversations that are normally had in the LSIP or in Indigenous spaces. It was a lot of things that have been said before, and whilst they're true and important things, such as the value of Indigenous knowledge in climate change discussions, these are things that already exist in writing under the UNFCCC, and we were not having the kind of space to have sufficient conversations about what Indigenous people need to do to ensure our own survival. Whether or not this just was a result of this year, I do think there is legitimate concerns that some people were afraid of backlash in Egypt for being too radical and protesting. Almost all the protests were held inside the COP rather than outside or on the streets, with the exception of just one protesting group that were out front, just outside the front doors. And I also have a lot of concerns about other issues in Egypt. There were credible reports of workers having to urinate in bottles because there were not toilet facilities provided for them. I am concerned about the hours they were working and under what pay, under what conditions, what rights they had. And I'm also really concerned about whether or not Indigenous rights, which are human rights and intrinsically related to gender equality and women's rights in climate change, if meaningful discussions around those can truly happen under an authoritarian regime, which is what LCC has currently in Egypt. I just want to congratulate Sanaa Saif, who is a well-known activist who did come to Egypt under the British delegation to petition world leaders to pressure Egypt to free her brother, Alaa Abdel Fattah, who has been in prison over spreading false news in Egypt for over a decade now, and was on a hunger and water strike throughout most of COP. His life was very much in danger for a lot of the COP, but reports do now appear that he is eating and drinking water again. But all in all, to sum up, I do have a lot of disappointment and concerns about whether or not this Egypt's COP could allow for meaningful conversations for Indigenous gender rights and for all minority groups, and whether or not COP is the right platform for any of these discussions if the presidency of the given country that year is not willing to dedicate an immense amount of time and resources to make sure that Indigenous people are given the proper platform that they deserve.
Thanks, Brianna, for those very honest and very telling remarks about what actually that local communities and Indigenous people's platform was like in Egypt. And I just wanted to just jump off that and ask you if you think that that was unique to this Egyptian presidency, or you think that in future UNFCCC processes and in COP, Indigenous people can be adequately represented? And anyone else can feel free to jump in as well.
Given that it was my first COP, I can't fully say how unique it was to the Egyptian COP. Some people have said that in previous years things were more radical and there was a greater youth showing. But there is some, things that are unique to COP and going to this, process that's held somewhere in the world every year that does make it really, really difficult for Indigenous people to be adequately represented. Sort of the first and most obvious is that the UNFCCC is built around the idea of states. So it's states who ultimately get a vote on the text of the articles and who make a decision. So the LSIP does officially have a place in the UNFCCC, but it's all non-binding. So the text around the LSIP basically has words like parties should, or else invites the parties to consider Indigenous knowledge. There's no strong words like must or will that actually mandates that the parties do anything with the recommendations from Indigenous people. And we also, when you have, Pacific nations where Indigenous people do make up a lot of the official delegation that go, they are, their needs like keeping 1.5 alive, making sure there is a loss and damage framework that, should have come a lot sooner than it did. They are steamrolled by these huge countries that refuse to take responsibility for the climate emergency and refuse to allow meaningful action on climate change to happen. So until there is either the the text around the LSIP is altered so that the recommendations that the LSIP provides to the UNFCCC has some sort of teeth and has some sort of actual meaning, or that Indigenous people outside of the state government, of the governments of the states that go to COP, have an ability to make some sort of decision, I don't think that they can be adequately represented. And there is things that individual governments can do to at least better represent their own Indigenous people. I think that the Australian government should, one, pay for Indigenous people to attend COP, as that is the Australian government. I actually met with Jenny McAllister when we were in COP, and she is, really keen on having Indigenous knowledge at COP and did seem really open to the things we were suggesting to her. But if the Australian government is serious and means what it says about how Indigenous people are important to the climate change dialogue and that their knowledge is key to tackling climate change, then they need to pay to have those Indigenous people show up at COP, because it is simply unfair for that huge monetary burden to be put on Indigenous people themselves. And that leads into the other point about how it's really difficult for Indigenous people to be adequately represented at COP, is because, especially in Australia, Indigenous people are historically and continue to be a marginalised group. And poverty is rampant amongst our communities. So we do, of course, have people like myself. I'm in an immensely privileged situation where I have a really good job that I can take paid leave from, and I'm here at ANU and they can pay for me to go, so I'm not financially burdened by going to COP. But if we want our elders, our knowledge holders, and our people who are actually living in our remote communities who are most impacted by climate change to be able to go to these events and discuss things, how are they supposed to meaningfully do that when it costs minimum $10,000 for a 3-week trip? And not including if you're a casual worker and you need to take time off work, that your family relies on that money, or you have to take unpaid time off. That is a huge financial burden to an individual that they cannot, it's unfair to expect them to take that on to be able to then attend COP, where they will not even really be listened to. You'll have people who are keen, they're like, we want Indigenous knowledge, have this panel.
I might need to, I think this is an incredibly important conversation, and I feel very conflicted interrupting what you're saying. Absolutely. And I hope that we will be able to pick up some of this in the Q&A and perhaps after as well. I just wanted to, I guess, bring George into the conversation as well. You mentioned, Pacific Island nations and negotiators, and as someone who has negotiated for several different nations over the past few years, I was wondering if you could share with the audience your experience of how you do overcome some of these barriers of being, listened to as a extremely climate vulnerable region, and perhaps, one with, less power, and how you come together and build coalitions to get your priorities on the agenda. For example, like loss and damage this year.
Sure. Thank you. And in terms of working for, supporting Pacific Island countries, I support for a regional organization where it's called the Secretariat Pacific Region Environmental Program, where they have a mechanism for all regional organizations who work under one, which they call the one crop mechanism. And so they provide the back-end support for the 14 Pacific Island countries who are party to the UNFCCC during negotiations, before negotiations, and after negotiations. So it's more like team of advisors advising countries. They bring in experts from the Pacific, but also from university like myself to support countries. So last year I supported them on Article 6. This year it was on the area of gender. The Pacific has 6 key priorities which they progress into negotiations. That stems from, of course, mitigation, adaptation, finance, and this year was gender. Because the region has said we need to elevate the voices of women in the negotiations, and how we bring in findings and all the work under the CSW into the work of UNFCCC. And so this year was bringing about forth a gender campaign into the negotiations, especially the current state of where it is in terms of gender action plan. Part of this is having a gender champion. So a minister from the Pacific who can speak on these issues all the way to the last moments. We have the minister from UA, So this year I supported them under the New Way delegation. Part of this is also, as I said, supporting the 14 different countries in terms of different technical issues. So we have training right throughout the year. And of course, this is done both online and by providing that support during the negotiation. And then of course, it's bringing a civil society. So we partner through the regional and partner with organizations around the Pacific to provide a gender campaign. And one of the things that we really want to see is a presidency that can support gender, not just as a soft issue, but as a key core issue, a gender COP. Just as how Fiji supported during their presidency an ocean COP, whereas elevated ocean, but gender not just by gender balance, that we have equal number of women, men and women, that doesn't do anything, right? It's about the system. And part of this, finance for women, or some ideas are like a woman and man president in a COP, you know, different ideas that say that there should be the voices of women in these negotiations, but also what we had tried to put forth, simplified access for local community, women, indigenous groups, right? It's not just about having funding for women. If our governments are having such a hard time writing grants, proposals, or even loan proposals for these big climate finance, then of course, women in local grassroots and even vulnerable groups will not have able to these access of these funds. So that's part of that work as well, is ensuring that some of the findings that we have in our research here in ANU are also part of what decisions and the conversations are having, so that you have these access, and that's where we come through in providing the support. This year, we were able to bring alongside our First Nations and Pacific students, and some of them were part of these delegations in supporting their work, because other universities of Pacific have students supporting. And it's about building that relationship of not just technical negotiators, not just of leaders, but of civil society and academia. This year, part of this diplomacy that we have in terms of the one Prop P6 was the first ever time we had Australia in a room, in a meeting bilateral with Pacific countries. That has never happened through the invitation of New Zealand. But this is about building towards that gradual step, the Pacific Australia or Australia Pacific COP, whichever way you want to look at it. You had to build that diplomacy during negotiations, because we do not talk to each other during the negotiations. But gradually we've seen these steps. Of course, we see it through the new government coming through, the diplomacy of Minister Penny Wong, but at the same time, what also happens during negotiations, building that conversation. And that's, I would say, some pluses in terms of, for me, that slowly building. Of course, there are those who say, well, we need to have shared positions in negotiations, but at the same time, it's also about shared vision. And if there's going to be that COP in 2026, the work needs to start now. And we started to see some of that during this negotiations.
Absolutely. Thanks, George. And just shifting focus slightly, but also tying into what you were saying about action needing to happen if we are to host that COP26 in Australia with the Pacific. I was hoping to bring in Stephen and Howard on your thoughts about, you know, Stephen, you mentioned that we heard a lot at COP from Minister Chris Bowen that Australia is back, and whether you believe with the new NDC we put in, so our new mitigation targets, Australia really is back, and also the mechanisms that we're using to achieve those targets, if you think they are going to be effective for true emissions reduction. So I might pass on to Stephen online first. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is still.
Thanks, Mahaleni. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think certainly Australia's revised target of 43% by 2030 helped position Australia very strongly. I think, as Mark made in his introductory comments, that probably one of the weakest parts of the discussions was around mitigation. But Howard's also pointed to the robust discussions around Article 6. So if you think about where the COPs have come from with Kyoto, you know, binding targets, then to NDCs, and now, and under the Kyoto Protocol, obviously emissions trading, CDM, JI, and then so Article 6 is a very important kind of part of the negotiations, because it's essentially leading to that, you know, the whole carbon market space. John Connor from the Carbon Markets Institute was relatively happy with how the Article 6 discussions went. I spoke to Kate Hancock, as Howard mentioned. She was very instrumental in the huge volume of work that is required to kind of articulate the Article 6 elements. There's still a lot of work yet to be done, but she was certainly quite happy given the volume of work with where that was going. I think Australia was part of the group of countries pushing for language around emissions peaking by 2025. That didn't make it into the final text, but obviously Australia is part of that group of forward-leading countries trying to get stronger emissions, you know, language around emissions peaking, and also stronger targets. There was a Sharm el-Sheikh kind of mitigation program text that made it into the final text, but that's essentially a forward work program. There's a lot of pressure, I think, on countries now to update their targets. Whether or not Australia updates theirs in the next 12 to 24 months, I think Howard may be able to comment, or Mark, but I think Australia's certainly back. Its revised target of 43% was considered very well. An unrecognised part of Australia's action too is the way we're heading towards kind of 83% renewable energy in the grid by 2030. That's a really powerful mitigation effort, and it's probably undersold by Australia and probably not recognised enough in the media here. That's huge for a developed country to be kind of heading in that direction. I think if we are to host COP31 in 2026, that will be, I think, a huge part of how Australia is acting on climate change, how we are transitioning as a developed country, and how we can be a model for other countries around the world. And then the whole adaptation, bringing Indigenous knowledge into the adaptation. Into the adaptation equation. I know various state governments are working with Indigenous leaders to bring Indigenous knowledge into the adaptation story. And again, if we are to partner, having Australia Pacific Island COP, a great story to tell there on adaptation as well, as we can tell on the climate finance component as well. Howard, I'm sure you've got lots to add.
Thanks, Stephen. Howard, I could hear you agreeing throughout that. And I also just want to circle back to at the beginning. I saw when I think George or Mark actually mentioned the phasing down of fossil fuels, and I saw you kind of nodding along to that, and was wondering if you could speak to how that fits in with, the fact that text wasn't included in the COP.
Well, I think if you look at the text, actually, there was no real backsliding.
Yeah.
But what had been attempted during the COP was to extend the language on coal to other fossil fuels. That was resisted. I think the gas industry would be happy with the outcome of the COP because they avoided the finger being pointed at them. And I can see the hand of someone who several people in this room will know very well in that approach. I won't mention any names, but to go back to your first question, Mahalani, which is, how does Australia stand if we're really trying to host this COP with the Pacific? Is our position strong enough? Short answer, no. We will have to do a lot more. And if we can close down everyone in this room promises not to tell anyone, and all those on Zoom do the same. I will tell you that when I was a public servant, this is not the first time that people have suggested that Australia has to COP. And when I was a public servant during the Howard government, and people suggested that, I would just hang up because I knew how much pressure that even the express wish to host a COP, let alone being told you're going to do it, how much pressure that would have put on policy at the time. Now, of course, that I'm no longer in government, for exactly the same reason, I think it's a terrific idea that Australia should try to host a COP, because it will put pressure on. And I think we've got a government now that can capably respond to the pressure and can do a lot more. As Stephen said, very few people around the world know the story of Australia's increasing reliance on renewables in our grid, and that's, I mean, there are other countries that use more renewables than we do, but in all cases they have hydro, or in one case geothermal power. For a country that, when Stephen and I were in the AGO together, sourced 85% of its power from coal, this is a big deal, as Stephen says. So we've got more to do, but we do have, we do have a few feathers to fly with already. So I think we can, if we can fix the diplomacy, and that's very important. And Kristen Tilley, who's the new ambassador, I think is terrifically well placed to do that. And can I just pause for 1 second? I've got to tell the story about Kristen, because I don't think the ambassador is doing negotiations now, but Kristen, on her first negotiation in the UNFCCC, turned up on the first day to the delegation meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning, and whoever was the ambassador at the time said, "Oh, Kristen, look, can you just take care of, just go and sit in this particular negotiation, and we'll catch up at lunchtime." And that negotiation was one that had been going for, I think, 3 years, and there'd been one point that had held things up, and really the intent was just Kristen would go and just keep an eye on it. So when she came back at lunchtime, whoever was the ambassador at the time said, "Oh, Kristen, sorry that we sent you to this dead end sort of negotiation. We'll give you something more interesting to get your teeth into later. Shouldn't have sent you to something where there was no movement at all." And Kristen said, "Oh, I fixed it." No one had told her it was too hard, so she went away and fixed it. So we've got a great ambassador, I think, in place now. But she will have a real task on the diplomatic front, because as George said, as Stephen suggested, this is no trivial diplomatic effort. This is a monstrous task, and it will take years to do. The cost, for those people with green eye shades in the government who are adding it up now, is going to be very considerable, directly and indirectly. So it's a big job for Australia, and working closely with Pacific countries in a very integrated way. So there's not going to be an Australian agenda. It will be a joint agenda. Has to be, or within nanoseconds we'll be in big trouble. Then I think there's an enormous diplomatic task ahead. But I think we've got a government, and we've got people who will be implementing all of this and executing the task, who are capable of doing it. So I think if we can make it work between us and the Pacific friends, then we can really see hope for a COP that is much more than an increment.
Thanks so much, Stephen. That's I guess fills me with positivity to know that how much it's changed since you were working in government to now it's actually really talking about hosting this COP with the Pacific. And also thanks for sharing the story about Kristen, the personal anecdote. I think that's also really good to know that she's going to be leading the efforts, and perhaps we can host a COP with the Pacific that really does push Australia to be more ambitious in our climate efforts. So I'll just note that it's now 6:30 almost, so we're going to be opening up the Q&A, and so we're going to have a roving mic in the room going around, and we've also got some questions on Zoom. So I might start off with a question here in the audience. If people just want to see some hands already, if you have someone you'd specifically like to ask, it'd be great if you could please note that as well. And yeah, we might go to that.
This is a question mainly for George, but open to the panel. Last week, Vanuatu's new climate change minister said that Pacific support for the COP27 would be conditional on no new fossil fuel subsidies. Yet in October, the Labor government's budget announced another 1.5 billion for a new LNG gas hub in NT. I guess I'm wondering how likely you think it will be for other Pacific countries to join Vanuatu in this stance, and also how likely we can get some movement from the Australian government on ending fossil subsidies.
Well, I mean, the question on from Australia, that has to be asked to the Australian government to see whether or not other Pacific countries will join in this statement of conditional. The question is conditional. It's possible because you have countries like Tuvalu. So now there is another campaign going around for a treaty on ending fossil fuel at the moment. So that momentum is also good. But at the same time, there's also the bigger picture that this is an opportunity for all of us in this part of the world to provide leadership in this space together. Part of that is the message on fossil fuel, you know, and that's where a partnership would come through. But it's the bigger picture is there's much that Australia and the Pacific could, you know, share by providing new initiatives in new areas that we have not fully explored, that's still missing within the UNFCCC process. Now, of course, those who are in UNFCCC, so enough is enough. We already have a full agenda. We can't do this. We can't take on any more. But there are new things that we are seeing that's part of our society that we need to input, and maybe they can push it out, but as long as we have it in. Part of that is oceans. While it's there, it's still very weak. The other issue is on indigenous and traditional knowledge. It's there, but it's still very weak. The other issue is there on women and gender, but still very weak. These are opportunities. Even in the area of climate security, we still are finding our way through to define what it is for our nations and local communities, societies, but it needs to be there, right? It may not reach the, you know, so during our time when we do host this together, maybe a top priority, but it won't be there. So that's the opportunity, that's the optimism. But of course, I go back to your question as conditional. It's an important statement. It's a statement that the government in Australia and society also needs to be aware of. It's also shared by other Pacific countries. But at the same time, I also see the bigger picture of, you know, pushing it forward, although it's, as I said, as the statement said, it's conditional. Yeah.
Thank you, George. I think that segues nicely into another question that we have online, which perhaps the other panelists can speak to. So someone has asked, how can we realistically lobby to host a COP while increasing our extraction and export of fossil fuels? So perhaps from an Australian perspective, we might start off with Stephen. Are you online there? Maybe we'll start with Howard then.
I think Stephen's sort of pressed his button so he wouldn't have to answer. I can't answer, of course, for the government, but I think this is exactly the sort of question that I was referring to before when I said it'll put pressure on this. You can make a strong argument that I think that that you shouldn't subsidise or facilitate further fossil fuel ventures. I understand why the government has ruled that out, but for what it's worth, my personal view is that that's the sort of road we will certainly have to contemplate if our COP bid is to be successful, and by that I mean the COP itself is to be successful. This is the sort of difficult decision that will come to the cabinet. It's not these. There will be many of them that will have to go to the highest levels of government if this path is one we're going to take, I think. By the way, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think Mark referred earlier to
the only thing I.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Can you hear me okay? Sorry, Howard, I didn't mean to interrupt. Keep going.
No, you go ahead.
Of a Zoom lag.
Yeah.
Maybe you can finish off your
I was going to say, if I'm not mistaken, I think the word Mark mentioned earlier, that the ending of fossil fuel subsidies reference in the COP this year and last year, which uses the adjective inefficient. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's probably an Australian edition last year. It's a very, there's someone in this audience who knows this much better than I, and I'm looking at him right now. But this is a long-standing Australian position that there are efficient and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies.
Absolutely. I think it's important to note that specific word was used in the final text and what that means. And Stephen, are you online now again?
Yeah, apologies. My Wi-Fi is cutting in and out. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I think, again, I can't speak on behalf of the government, but, and apologies, I've turned my video off to save Wi-Fi. But Australia's kind of playing this balancing act of, transitioning its economy and its electricity sector to net zero. And we've talked about the high penetration and the increasing penetration of renewable energy. And I think the government's also saying to industry, we can keep digging up coal and gas and shipping offshore because those are not counted against Australia's emissions. They are emissions in those countries where the coal and gas is burnt or consumed. However, there are moves to report on Scope 3 emissions, increasing moves for countries to do that, which means that those Scope 3 emissions will be reported by Australia. And so those coal emissions that are burnt in China or the gas emissions that are burnt, the gas that's burnt in Japan will be reported on. So that's one thing that Australia will need to note. There's also a push by Europe to, border tax adjustments and other things which are making their way in the absence of countries pursuing carbon pricing. So I think all of these elements are playing into both the negotiations, the inventories, and how emissions are reporting. I think will place increasing pressure on Australia to manage, expanding coal and gas production, for example, and those exports. So that's the commentary I'd make. Hopefully that came through loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That was great. And I also just wanted to bring George into the conversation here. Before you were mentioning the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, I was just wondering if you could comment on how that could complement some of the processes that are happening in COP, especially with this, I guess some would say, watered down language around fossil fuels.
Good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Rhian whether you follow that issue.
I don't. I can say on the issue though that the establishing of new fossil fuel areas and money, especially natural gas plants, is a huge sticking point for a lot of Indigenous communities at the moment, and for Indigenous representatives that were at COP. And I think it's kind of important that we sort of see our Indigenous communities and work with them in a diplomatic process, very similar to that we do with other countries. Because at the moment, the government makes these decisions of, we're going to build here, we're going to do this. And, you know, theoretically, Indigenous people can have have sovereignty over the land and have land rights, but they don't actually have the ability to say no. And that is a massive problem because, you know, we can say that natural gas is cleaner or more efficient or whatever, but it ends up not being the land of people who are making the decisions that ends up getting built on or get through or poisoned. And so if we do want to host COP31 and we want our Indigenous people to be present en masse and engaged and a part of this process, that I think the government does need to carefully consider how we treat them when it comes to fossil fuels and our plans on that in the future.
Thanks, Brenda. Was there any other questions in the audience? Yeah, maybe we'll go stand on the front.
I'm Tom Weddington from the School of Computing here at the ANU. I like the description of the problems with the Egyptian meetings. It seems a bit last century to fly a whole lot of people around the world to discuss how to reduce carbon emissions. If Australia is bidding for this, should we bid for a blended meeting where there can be genuine participation in the process online, and so that we don't favour people from rich Western countries who can game the process by sending lots of people to it? And if we are going to do that, the ANU has a whole lot of computing students who can get it on.
Thank you. Maybe we could start with George coming from.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you're great. You know, it's fantastic. In fact, the comment that is pushed by developing countries is, let's have this as a hybrid event. Of course, the pushback is no, you know, it needs to be face to face. But there is a possibility of blended in terms of open to everyone. At the end, but the thing that we need to take into account when hosting a COP or being a president is that you have to find some form of consensus. And the other fact is that it's a state-led process, you know. And at that critical moment, you need a very close room with only a few people in that room. And that's how they were able to cross the line at the high level ministers or state leaders. That's how it's happened. I mean, how we're able to have this 3 weeks or 2 weeks of negotiations to come to some form of agreement. So yes, hybridity, yes, but at the critical moments, you still need to have that face-to-face interaction. And that's why it's also a critical strategy. For this year, you saw for Australia, you had 3 ministers there, 3 minister capacity, because one was incapacitated as a facilitator. That's the diplomacy. You can't be a negotiator while a facilitator. And you had 2 extra ministers. That's the strategy. But it pays to have a strategy like that. In the Pacific, we now have political champions, which are there to all the way to the last minute, even after. So that when that critical moment on the floor, when there's a rush to find that one country or party that will make that disagreement, you have Pacific ministers there also working on that dialogue. So yes, hybridity, great, but at that critical moment, you also need that critical strategy on the face-to-face. And that will only even become more critical when you are president of the COP, and to try and find that consensus.
Thanks, George. I think Howard, you had a point you wanted to add.
Just one point to add, to just remind us, I guess, that we're talking at the moment about the intergovernmental negotiations, which you could think of as the sort of inner circle of the COP. But these days, that's just a small part of the whole, you know, and Brianna was talking, there's so much else goes on. There's so many other 35,000 people this year, so many other things happening that in many ways are just as important and in most ways create more momentum than do those core negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Brianna and I spent a lot of time in the side events and pavilions and Action Hub, and like that is where we heard a lot of conversations about pushing forward progress and what they wanted to see from negotiations, and that's where the media was happening. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I really love the idea of a blended hybrid approach, and it's something that other international conferences have been doing over COVID, and it does, the infrastructure has to be seamless. I actually did get sick over the first official week of COP, so I tried to join a lot of the side events online, and that was with mixed results. So it really has to work well, especially for marginalised groups, for Indigenous people, when things like this, if there was a blended approach, when it doesn't work, it doesn't just become an inconvenience, it is a silencing of marginalised voices. But I would love for there to be a blended approach, especially that'd be great for people in our remote communities who may be too sick to travel, or elderly, or just not comfortable traveling, would save a lot of money. Or even if, because one thing that I love about COP is meeting people face to face and having those, I met someone in the lunch line who ended up being really interested in my research. So even if there was, many regional hubs that people in that area would come to and would be able to join side events online or something like that. But I do feel, I met a guy at a bar and he was like, so what's this COP about? And then his first thing as just like some random British tourist was like, it doesn't make sense for a climate change conference to fly all of these people around the world. And I was like, you've got a point.
I think that is a common frustration that people share, especially people that I've told, I'm going to COP, like, are you offsetting your emissions to get there? So it looks like there might be an opportunity for some ANU computer students in COP26. So we do have another question, Howard. I know you might have to duck off a few minutes early, and this one's directed to you. So someone online has asked, what prior diplomacy and negotiations need to happen before the next COPs to clarify responsibilities about loss and damage funding, what sources as well as countries like the global banks, other banks, relevant businesses like coal, oil and gas companies?
Yeah, it's a very good question. George would be better able to answer than I, but there has been a transitional committee established on the similar model to the basis on which the terms of reference, if you like, for the Green Climate Fund were negotiated. This one's supposed to report to the next COP, but fingers crossed that will happen. Miracles do happen. So it could, but it's supposed to work out how to operationalise this decision about the fund. And of course, there was no money in the Green Climate Fund at the beginning either. Then the then Secretary General did a full court press on leaders around the world. He called them and sort of basically told them what they were going to pay. So if there is going to be funding that is truly new and additional found for loss and damage, it will require, I think, apart from all the negotiating by the delegates, it'll require very high level effort to extract that funding. There's a bit of a tendency, I think, if I can oversimplify, for developing country negotiators to think that, there's a magic pudding and you just put more pressure on and more money will come from developed countries. For developed country negotiators to think there's a bottom line, that we're not going to increase the budget. I can't go back and tell the finance department that we've got. So there's a truth somewhere in the middle, but finding that is always very difficult.
And George, you spoke to before about in loss and damage, the devil being in the detail.
Yeah, I mean, it's what Howard just mentioned, but also, you know, as we're trying to see where that funding could come from, is also looking at different, not innovative, but initiatives that have floated around, and there's quite a few, and even something that was pushed forth by the UN Secretary General, that it could come from a percentage of the profits of fossil fuel companies, or and that would be even more controversial. You know, that's a whole different debate, but philanthropy or whatever. So there's even that. I mean, and again, there needs to be a report that goes to COP, and we'll see. I think the example that I gave 8 years is the GCF example. That decision was made in 2010, but they only operationalized in 2018.
Yeah.
That's how far it came.
I think there's one thing worth mentioning, that, and a particular difficulty in the context of the loss and damage fund, is that by definition, it's going to be very difficult to get the private sector involved. If you look at, you know, the other two pillars of the climate effort, mitigation, it's easy to get private sector involved because there are lots of profitable opportunities that reduce emissions and enable companies to make a profit. There's been a struggle over the last few years to get private sector more into adaptation, but I think that's now beginning to bear fruit, and we're seeing a lot more private investment in often mixed activities, mitigation and adaptation. But getting the private sector into loss and damage is a different order of difficulty, I think. And why am I talking about the private sector? Because that's where the money is. I think we recognise that developed country budgets are constrained, particularly at the moment. And the one thing the world's not short of is money. There's plenty of it. It's just doing the wrong things.
Can I ask George? I heard in the negotiations that I was observing on loss and damage, they mentioned innovative sources of financing a lot, and just before you specifically said not innovative. So is there something in that wording that doesn't sit right with you? Oh, no. No, okay. I just thought I'd check there. And Stephen, I saw you've turned your camera on. Was there anything you wanted to add to this question?
The only thing I'd add is there has been a lot of examination of just transition as well, and financing. I went to a session around philanthropy being directed to particularly just transition in South countries. But as we know, a lot of philanthropy currently goes to developed countries. It often goes to organizations which are led by white people, and those white people just happen to be men. So there actually was quite a lot of discussion behind the scenes about philanthropy funding being directed towards South countries led by women and of colour. So, and also much more investment in knowledge. No one knows how many people, for example, in India are employed by the coal sector or the gas sector because of the informal economy, the cash economy or the barter economy. So when we talk about just transition over the next 5, 7, 8, 10 years, how many people will be affected as we transition away from coal and gas, and how do we, and oil, and how do we, those people, particularly in developing countries, have alternative sources of employment. So that was another, just adding to another dimension of discussions around funding, and particularly from the philanthropic funding perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Brianna, is there anything you'd like to add on? No. Is there any more questions in the audience? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I just want to return to the issue of Africa as the regional issues around Africa. And just reading an article now, the president of Uganda is accusing Western countries of hypocrisy and double standards for, in his view, refusing energy investment for fossil fuel development. for African countries to use themselves, or will allow the investment for fossil fuels that will flow to developed countries. And I really, that strikes me as a fairly major tension. And I want to, for anyone on the panel, to just reflect on whether you see a path to resolving that kind of tension.
I think there's been a lot of media attention to that issue in the last 6 weeks or so. And I can't say that I followed it closely, but I think that it really goes to mainly positions taken sometimes rather carelessly, perhaps by European politicians in particular, and not exclusively, but in particular. And it does smack of that sort of sense that do as we say, not as we do. So I think it's another pressure. I think we're now starting to see, not overtly all the time, but we're starting to see big changes occurring. I think generally, greenwashing. I think I can now confidently say greenwashing is going to be dead soon, because there's such a strong global push to end it. But what do I mean? I mean companies just saying, okay, well, yeah, sign us up for the net zero by 50, and then walking away and not really doing anything about it. So that sort of behaviour is going to be right in the crosshairs, and I think this is an example of the sort of thing that countries are going to have to account for. How do we reconcile the differences? And you can see in any country, there's a certain amount of walking both sides of the street that goes on, all countries. And if you're identified as doing that, then you're going to have to respond.
So any of the other panelists want to comment? Yeah. All right, and I saw one more question.
Sorry, Melanie. There was a lot of pressure being applied from European NGOs for kind of blanket statements around Africa going fossil free. And as Howard's mentioned, it's not as simple as that. I mean, for some African countries and some of the youth activists I was speaking to from Africa, they were saying, we want rural electrification, regardless of whether it's renewables or fossil fuels, because we want to educate our children. We need lighting at night time so our children can read and do their homework. So there was a lot of tension around this kind of blanket, Africa should be fossil free. And as Howard's pointed to, it's not as simple as that. And also, it's, European nations as well as the US and Australia and other countries are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So why should we just say that Africa should be fossil free? So that was certainly a dimension behind the scenes in the negotiations. And, every African country is different. And every African country will have a different position on, certainly in the short term, potentially using fossil fuels to get electricity to villages as opposed to renewables. But also it comes back to the funding story. If there's funding for renewables and they can be reliably applied to electrify villages, then that's ultimately the way we should be going. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen, for those additional comments. And I believe we have time for one or two more questions. I saw one in the back, or two in the back.
This is for all the panelists, I suppose. It seemed that much of the disappointment of COP27 was surrounding lack of ambition towards mitigation targets specifically, and keeping 1.5 alive in that text. Given we're at the 27th COP and we can't even acknowledge that we need a phase out of fossil fuels in our final cover decision, other than that specifically mention of unabated coal. Do you think that COP is the right mechanism for the deep mitigation needed to move us towards a 1.5 degree world? And if you don't, do you think there are different international mechanisms that we can use towards greater mitigation ambition?
Thanks. I might give everyone an opportunity to quickly answer as the last question. If you'd like, George, did you have any comments on that?
At the moment, we don't have a better system that brings all parties. This is the system that we have at the moment. And as much as we would like to go back and start from COP1, we need, we'll go back many steps back. And so while there are those of us who don't like what we have, we still need to bring everyone to the table. I mean, there have been talks about regional hubs, regional initiatives to see this, but you won't capture everyone. You won't capture the developed, the least developed, and you won't develop the new countries, the emerging economies that will be the source of the greater pollution in our time. And so while I am not optimistic, I'm also pragmatic that part of this is investment in this endeavor. But at the same time, it's also, as we say every day, the pressure that we have for governments, to our individual governments, to send the signal. They need to create it through their policies, in the climate laws, legislation, in the announcements for investors and for those of us, working on the ground. You need to create signals that we need that transition. It's going to be a very slow transition all around. Even in my own island country, it's a very hard transition. Like, we need fossil fuel for electricity today, tomorrow, and the next 10 years. But we need signals and investment that see us crossing that pathway. So pragmatic, it's the system that we have and that we need to. And hopefully this university can give us an idea of what the next best system is. But until we have that my would say is we need to keep going on with this process.
Thanks, George. So we've just got a minute left. So I'll give,
Sorry.
no, that's okay. An opportunity for you all to have some quick remarks. Brianna.
Yeah, I agree a lot with George. It is unfortunately the system we have. It is slow. It has a lot of issues. It's really hard to just not get very frustrated with it. Be like, oh, stuff it. Like, this clearly is too slow. It's not addressing the issues. But I think a big elephant in the room that isn't really discussed at COP is, as long as we live in a society where big businesses, fossil fuel industry, has so much power and so much control and money, then that can be used to persuade governments and push policy certain ways, that we are going to really struggle to keep 1.5 alive in time to avoid complete climate catastrophe.
I think it's necessary, but not sufficient. Unfortunately, there are many other forces, I suppose is the right word perhaps, that are working at the same time as the negotiations, and they feed back and forth. There's in my view, one word solution to the climate problem: investment. Our task is to change the direction of global investment, public and private. And one instrument in that change is the network of central banks, for example, for greening the financial system. That's starting to gather momentum. So I think that the intergovernmental process is, as I said earlier, at the core, but there's so much more happening and reacting with that, there is a gathering momentum. Whether we will keep 1.5 alive over the longer term, I don't know, but we've just got to press all the buttons that we have, I think.
Thanks, Howard. And Stephen, is there any final remarks you'd like to make?
Yeah, we definitely need the UNFCCC framework. We need COPs. but all of the national action, the action by industry, big business and subnational governments obviously influence how the COPs and the UNFCCC process unfolds. And as we've seen in Australia, you know, subnational governments kind of led action on climate change and renewables for many years. And then you have a change in the national government and you get leadership and cohesion and coordination. And similarly internationally, where you get certain countries kind of leading and demonstrating what's possible. And I think Australia has kind of undersold what we're doing and what we can demonstrate what is possible, and that then influences the overarching framework about what is possible. So I think it's always about the mixture of these different dimensions and how they come to bear and influence. But overall, we need the UNFCCC framework. Again, when we're talking about carbon markets and linking, if you don't have an international framework for carbon markets and how carbon credits and how countries and businesses across the world can stimulate action in the carbon markets perspective, then you don't have effective carbon markets. So, and similarly on the whole reporting and inventory side of things, we need that consistency and that overarching consistency of reporting so we can monitor and report and review how we're tracking against different targets. So I think we need all of those elements to make a successful action on climate change. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. So just noting the time, I think that's a good question on the overall COP process to end on. And I'd just like to thank all of the panelists so much for your time and for joining us from overseas and jet lagged, and also to the Institute for putting on this event tonight. And you can also find a recording of the event online in the coming days. So thank you, everyone.